Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Far Beyond the Stars, which is episode 13 of season 6 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my Patreon user polls. I didn't get much participation in this month's Patreon user poll. I just got 2 votes for 2 different episodes, so it's a tie. So I chose the episode Far Beyond the Stars out of the 2. The other one was Cause and Effect, which I had just watched very recently, so instead I decided to review Far Beyond the Stars. So this is the episode where Captain Sisko is thinking about retiring from Starfleet because he's exhausted by the war, and he receives a vision from the prophets in which he's a writer in the 1960s dealing with racism, and this vision gives him the strength to go on and continue as Starfleet captain. So, before I get into my feelings in the episode, I want to start with my personal experience of this episode, because as I talked about in some of my previous videos, when season 6 of Deep Space Nine came out, that was my party year. That's when I was 19, and I used to go out and get drunk and stoned and just go to parties all the time, and so I missed a lot of episodes of that season because of that. Now I didn't miss all of them. I did see a couple. I remember watching In the Pale Moonlight when I was really stoned, which actually increased my enjoyment of the episode. But I missed this one entirely. This one I didn't even know existed and it's funny because the first time I heard of this is when I went to the bookstore and I was looking at Star Trek books, and I saw that they had a book for this episode, and I actually had no idea that it was an episode. I thought it was an original book. And I was like, this looks stupid. And I put it back. But then later, my sister told me about this. I was about this episode. Oh, did you see the one where Sisko went back to had a vision of the prophets and he was in the 60s? And I was like, oh, that's an episode? So that's the first time I realized that it was. And so it wasn't until years later, I think in 1999, when I went to New Zealand, they had VHS tapes of Deep Space Nine with 2 episodes each, which apparently for them it was an advanced viewing because they're on TV. They were several seasons behind. So I bought that VHS for Far Beyond the Stars, and that's the first time I saw it. So it was, I believe this episode came out in 98, so it was a year after. It was after I'd seen season 7, so I've finished watching the entire show of Deep Space Nine before I saw this episode. But I was aware of its existence. So I kind of already had this sort of build up to it, because by the time I got the VHS, I heard it was a great episode and I should watch it. And I think the hype kind of built me up, and I was sort of convinced myself for the longest time that this episode was amazing, was one of the best episodes. But and a lot of people do consider this episode one of the best episodes of the show, but watching it with an analytical eye, which is what I did recently when I watched every episode of Deep Space Nine for my season-long reviews, and of course watching it now, trying to pay close attention, I wouldn't say this is one of my favorite episodes or one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine. It's a good episode, but I don't think it's amazing. Now, obviously, I do like it a lot for the statement it makes about racism. I think that's quite powerful, and I think it's important to have that in the show Deep Space Nine, because usually, the whole point of having I want to say African American, because Sisko's not American, he's a Starfleet officer. But anyway, having a black man be the captain of the space station in this ideal version of the future, the whole point is that people don't care. They don't point out Oh, why is this black guy being the captain? I don't trust him because he's black or whatever. They just don't give a shit, and especially in the future like this where there's all these aliens and whatnot, people far moved past their prejudices, which is the point of Star Trek. So the whole point of the show is never to point out any sort of racism, and to present a future, idealized future where we move past such prejudices. So I think it's kind of important to have an episode that goes back to an earlier time where these prejudices did exist, and to point out the contrast between modern times and this idealized version of the future, and what it took to get to this idealized version of the future, and that this history is still important to Cisco, which we'll see more about, because in future episodes this is referenced more, and you see that this is a history that Cisco himself thinks is important, which is good. So I like that. But it's interesting because my sister in her old channel, she had an interesting thesis that the episode kind of loses some of its commentary power by setting itself in the 60s and not for what this episode would be present day. Like if they set it in 98 to deal with the racism that exists in 98, it would have been more powerful, because if you set it in the 60s, it's almost like it's a common thing, especially that's really relevant to contemporary times where a lot of people were saying that racism no longer exists and we've defeated racism, which of course is a whole bunch of nonsense, and people who usually say that tend to be racist. Sorry, it's true, because it's absolutely not the case. And so those people's argument would be, well, the 60s, that's when the racism exists, and we're all past that, and we're all better now. Now, granted, it's not as bad as it was in the 60s. I mean, that's for sure. But a lot of people... That's what I'm saying, or at least this is my sister's thesis, is by setting it in the 60s, it's too easy to be like, oh yeah, this is something in the past that we've overcome, especially if you compare that to the Star Trek future where they did overcome this kind of discrimination. Then it kind of sends a message that, oh yes, we've overcome it in present day, which I'm not sure if I completely agree with that thesis, but I thought it was an interesting thesis because I actually didn't think about it until she mentioned it. But I do agree that they should have said it in the 90s. I absolutely agree. I mean, it was definitely still a hot topic in the 90s with the Rodney King incident happening in the early 90s and the race riots that resulted from that. So and of course it's really still a hot button topic now with everything that's going on, especially it's almost more relevant now. Well, I wouldn't say more relevant, but it's more public, shall I say, to that the fact that this episode deals with white policemen beating a black man for no good reason just because he's black, which is the relevant commentary in the 60s and the 90s and present day as well. So I kind of see that setting in the 60s makes it a bit too easy, and would be easy for people to say, oh yeah, that was back then, but we're much better now. So if they set it in present day, would have been better. So yeah, I agree with that aspect of it. But of course, the reason they said in the 60s is because Ira Stephen Bear is obsessed with the 60s and he wanted any excuse to set an episode in the 60s. So that's the real reason why it's set in the 60s. He always makes reference. In fact, I'm surprised he didn't set it in the 40s, because he always makes reference to all these classic movies like Casablanca and all those Humphrey Bogart stuff. And you notice they referenced a movie, Burt Lancaster, what was it called, From Here to Eternity or something. I never even heard of it. I don't like classic movies that much, to be fair. Anyway, so So Ira Stephen Bear is obsessed with him, and he's obsessed with like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So that's why he said it in this time. Although I will give Ira Stephen Bear credit that he at least said his in the 60s to point out racism, where Brenna Braga is his idealized version of the 50s, which he tried to do in Enterprise, is the idealized version that whitewashes racism, tries to pretend like it didn't exist, like Carbon Creek, I believe the episode title from Enterprise, was my huge critique about that. Oh, look at how all these nice, decent folk, 50s, what an innocent time. Let's just ignore all the racism and discrimination against people of color and women that existed back then. Let's just whitewash this because the 50s is so perfect. The Waltons. That's really the feel I got for all of Enterprise, although it was really crystallized in that Carbon Creek episode. But anyway, not talking about that. So Ira Stephen Bear, better than Brenna Braga, at least. But they're just obsessed with that time period. And I never was, frankly, when he has that lounge singer who sings Frank Sinatra songs that show up later in the show. Fuck that guy. And because he's just obsessed with this, which, I think Deep Space Nine could have done without it. But, it's a good episode nonetheless. But that's why it's set in the 60s and not the 90s. I think it would have been a better episode had it been set in the 90s. Anyway, the one thing that always brings this episode down for me is the framing device, the plot of the episode, which I think is fairly nonsensical. It's there for plot convenience. It's just there to give an excuse so they could have this episode with these writers in the 60s, and they take the actors that we know and put them outside of their makeup and put them in different roles, which is cool and a novelty. And they make a powerful commentary about racism, which really works. But the plot and the framing device is just a giant excuse to do that. It doesn't actually make much sense in its own right. Now, I will grant you it is not as bad as the 1159 episode in Voyager, where they had an episode set in the turn of the millennium in 1999. And the framing device for that episode was just a big ball of nonsense. Like, it was the dumbest thing ever. It was just a giant excuse because Brenna Braga wanted to do a contemporary episode. So this one isn't quite as bad as that, but it still ain't that great. So the framing device is that Sisko is like, oh, I'm going to quit the war. I can't handle this. And so he, so he gets this vision from the prophets for no reason. It just, and Bashir says, oh, this is, your medical readings is similar to what it was last year when you had those visions with the, where he was like, locust! I love saying that. Anyway, so what was that episode called? Rapture, that's right. Anyway, he's saying that, his medical readings are similar to that, and he's having visions from the prophets. But they, at least in the episode Rapture, there was a reason. Like, he had like this energy thing shocked him, and he was having these visions. Where here it's just like out of nowhere for no reason, and it's just like, well, whatever. So the prophets send him a vision of a writer, science fiction writer in the 60s, who is experiencing racism. And he's trying to get his story published, and he doesn't get it published, and he's eventually has a mental breakdown and starting a mental institution, and this inspires Sisko to stay in the war? Really? Like, what the hell does that have to do with staying in Starfleet? I don't think it has anything to do with staying in Starfleet. Now, you could argue that it inspired Sisko because he could see how Benny Russell had to deal with to overcome his obstacles in his life with racism and whatnot, and that inspired Sisko to deal with his obstacles and stay in the good fight. But I think that's a very, very, very loose, very flimsy explanation, but I do believe it is the one this episode is trying to sell. And I don't think it quite works. Quite frankly, I think it just comes off as a giant excuse to have an episode set in the 60s. That's all. That's all it is. And I don't buy the Prophet's involvement in it. And I think, like, when they're in the 60s and Benny Russell keeps having the flashes to, like, he keeps seeing snippets of Deep Space Nine times. That's meant to be all cool and everything, and I think obviously the whole point is to sort of blend reality and fiction. What is real, what is fiction, which I don't know. I don't know if I like that aspect of it, but the whole blending thing where, like, you know, Michael Dorn's character all of a sudden turns into Worf and is like, "Did you see the game?" and like startle him and stuff like that. Like, I think that comes off as kind of pretentious to me, if I'm being perfectly honest. Like, I don't. Usually, I like mind-bending, mind-twisty stuff, but in this case, it feels too telegraphed. It feels too contrived. So, I didn't really like it as much. Although I did kind of like when the two policemen were beating the crap out of Benny Russell, that they flashed from Wei-Yun and Dukat being the ones beating them. Like, I don't know, but in some ways it's like too obvious of the imagery. But it was making it very clear that the law enforcement, the police officers, were actually the villains. So that part I did like. As it pertained to this particular story, I'm not demonizing all police officers, but definitely when it comes to the systemic racism that was in the police department in the 60s, and it still exists today. It's very important. Anyway, yeah, so I did like that aspect of it. And I think the actors were loving it, having a good job playing different roles and not having to wear their stupid makeup, especially people like Rene Aubergenois and God, why am I blanking on the name? The dude who plays Quark, Armin Shimmerman, who plays Quark. They finally, and Michael Dorn for that matter, they don't have to deal with all this crap on their foreheads, and they can just. It's a shame that Andrew Robinson wasn't in this episode, but they had the dude who played Nog show up at the start, and the guy who played Martok was the one who was the Drawler or whatever. Yeah, it's funny, I didn't recognize him when I first saw this episode, but I watched it now. It's like very obviously Martok. I don't know how I couldn't see that, but anyway, so yeah, they all had fun doing that, and it shows because they do a really good job, and it was really smartly written. The characters have really good, smart interactions. The way they like joke and have these quips and whatnot really worked. And it's funny because they are just joking, having quips, but there is like an element of real hostility behind it, especially when Rene Aubergenois' character would say something racist, they would treat it like get all pissy, but they treat it as a joke. But obviously there was like some real like heat behind those kidding around stuff. And I loved Calmini's character, the author who wrote about robots. Well, I like robots. They're very efficient. Like he had that little quirkiness about him that I really think was I loved that. I thought it was really good. And I heard that I think they called Nana Visitor's character was Casey something, and I think I heard that she was based off of DC Fontana, who of course wrote for the original series and had to put initials so people didn't know it was a woman who was writing. So I think they based her off of that, and so that was great, and I thought she did a really great job in that role. Terry Farrell's character I didn't really like when she went, "Ooh, she's got a worm in her belly." Like, oh, get it? Because it's Dax who's saying it? Ha ha. No. Sorry, I didn't like that. That was a bit too obvious for me, and I didn't really like her character overall. She seemed they just needed something for Terry Farrell to do. I really liked, God, always blanking on these actors' name. The guy who plays Jake. Cyric Laughlin. He does a really good job. And it's interesting. I do like how they don't make him Benny Russell's son. They just make him a friend, this random guy. It's like, I want to get some cash, and it's good to get that different perspective, because Benny Russell had the more optimistic future, like vision of future of equality for African Americans, where Cyric Laughlin's character is like, yeah, we'll be nothing but, we're never going to be anything but N-words to them, and it's understandable how someone would have that view, especially dealing with as much discrimination that they had to deal with back then. So and then you also get the perspective of Michael Dorn's character, who is a baseball player, but he's saying that they still, even though he's like a famous baseball player, he would be looked down upon because of his race if he was in predominantly white areas, which is why he stays to African American areas. So yeah, all that different like window of perspective actually really works for the episode, and really draws out the situation. It's interesting that they had Joseph Sisko take on the role of the preacher, who is like being the obvious like surrogate for the prophets, and it's supposed to be all weird and look, and I don't really get what the point of it. He's like, write the words, Brother Benny, but he does, and nobody reads it, and he just has a mental breakdown. So I don't really see the point of it, to be honest. I don't know, that mysticism thing, I don't think that Ira Stephen Bear does it very well, and sometimes when he tries to make Deep Space Nine more like a fantasy, it doesn't come out that well to me. Anyway, I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking. But the other thing I was gonna say, now Avery Brooks directed this episode, and I think he did a great job. He's a really good director. I've talked about that before. I love the episodes that he directs. Like I said, like the chemistry the characters had really worked. But Avery Brooks is a great director. I'm not that sold on his acting, though. And here's the thing, and I'm just watching this without like just trying to judge Benny Russell as a character. He's way too like hot-headed, or not hot-headed, but too sort of unstable. I think that's the word I'm looking for. I think it would be better if Benny Russell was played more as a serious, like, stable writer, rather than someone who is like when he has I mean, I can kind of understand why he would have the mental breakdown, because he just got, his friend was just killed and shot by the police, and he was just beaten to fuck by the police, by the same police that killed his friend. And then he goes to work to find out that his story is not getting published, which is what he had all of his hope and dreams on. And more than that, he's fired. So basically his whole entire life is ruined. So you can understand him having a mental breakdown, but I still think Avery Brooks overacts this part. I'm sorry. I think that Avery Brooks is a criminal overactor, and not just that part, but throughout the other episode when he was like, just like his acting in particular it was too, I think if they, I know you can't get a different actor because it has to be Benjamin Sisko, but if you had a different actor in the role, I think they could have sold it better, because you kind of see him as unstable and temperamental, where if they had a more stable element who wouldn't fly off the handle at the slightest thing, and just the way he's like all excited and singing and dancing just because his story's getting sold, it makes him seem like manic, like he's manic depressive or something. And I just think that they had a more normal writer that it would have sold the episode better. Just have Avery Brooks play it more low key, but then again, he's directing it, so he's gonna go all crazy like he wants to. And so maybe they should have had someone else direct the episode to sort of be like, turn it down, Avery, turn it down. Because I think it would have worked better if he wasn't so like, so freaking manic. He's really unstable. But anyway, and as far as the breakdown goes, yes, it makes sense that he would have a mental breakdown, but you understand, it's real. It's real. Oh, like, come on. Anyway, have you ever seen that mashup they have on YouTube where it had the it's a fake and it's real, and the two are arguing with each other? It's a fake, it's a real. Oh my god, I lost my shit when I first saw that. Anyway, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. I really enjoyed it. I think the strong social commentary really worked. It was relevant for Deep Space Nine. It's what it needed. But it could have been done better. They could have came up with a better framing device. I think they were kind of lazy with their framing device. I think Avery Brooks' acting was a bit over the top. But the other actors, I think, did an amazing job. I thought the chemistry and different ways they threw them in there really worked. But yeah. So anyway, my rating for Far Beyond the Stars out of 10. I'm going to give this an 8. Extremely good. As I said, I don't think this is one of the best episodes of the show. It's not top 10 material for me, where I've seen a lot of other people put in the top 10 because of those flaws I mentioned. The acting from Avery Brooks is over the top, and the framing devices is lazy. And it doesn't really seem to fit into the overall story of season 6, and I think they could have done a better job at it. So that is my rating for this episode, an 8 out of 10. However, before I go, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And that is, and it doesn't exactly have to pertain to this episode, but in the finale, the final episode of Deep Space Nine, Ira Stephen Bear wanted to end the episode with a sort of a flashback to Benny Russell, which made it ambiguous as to whether Deep Space Nine really existed. Who was the real person? Was it Benjamin Sisko, or was it Benny Russell? Or was this whole thing? Oh, he wanted to have it like a TV set, to have it like so the whole thing was just filmed by Benny Russell or something, or that it was just his writings. And you know what? I bash Rick Berman, and I put him down a lot, and I think deservedly so. I think he ruined the last. I think he is the main reason why Star Trek died in the 2000s. A lot of people try to blame Nemesis, or try to blame this and that, or franchise fatigue, or whatever other bullshit. No, it was Rick Berman. He is directly responsible for crashing Star Trek, because it's the last 3 seasons of Voyager were his fault why they went downhill. Enterprise sucking is his fault. And the reason why Nemesis did so poorly was also his fault. So I put a lot of blame on Rick Berman, but I gotta give him credit. Give the man credit where credit is due. When Ira Stephen Bear tried to do the stupid ending, he shot him down. I was like, no, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. Thank you. I mean, honestly, anyone with a brain could see that that was a really stupid idea. I think it was kind of... I love Ira Stephen Bear. Well, not love him, because I think there's a lot of things he did wrong, but there's a lot of things he did right, too, because, of course, Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek show, and he was the showrunner for it. So he did do a lot of things right, but I don't think he respects Star Trek as a whole, and Rick Berman's reasoning for denying that ending was, so you're gonna say that Voyager and Next Generation and the original series were all a dream too? And he's like, well, I don't care about those other shows. That's how it fucking works, Ira. It's a part of a franchise. You can't just say one aspect of it was all. And plus, all right, even take that argument out of it. Take that whole bigger franchise argument out of it. That's the ending a show with it was just a dream, or it's just a thing, is a cheap, horrible, terrible way to end any story. Any writing experts will tell you it's a cheat. It doesn't work. It's like the whole, like, oh, it was in a snow globe or whatever. It's rightfully picked on and made fun of as terrible, terrible endings. I think the Bob Newhart show, when they did that, they were kind of just mocking it. It was all a dream or whatever from his previous show. But yeah, he wanted to do that seriously, and no, that's terrible. Now, I know where he's coming from. He's trying to mix into, blend reality, which is what he does in this episode when he has the flashes of Benny. It's like, what's real, the dream or the dream? But when I watch this episode, I think it's very clear that Benjamin Sisko is what's real. It's real. It's just an interesting philosophical question, and it works in that way. But had they did that ending, that wouldn't have been taking it way, 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 way too far, and it would have been the worst way to end the show. I'm so thankful that the studios wouldn't let Ira Steven Behr do that, and it really lowers my opinion of him that he even wanted to do that. Anyway. So that's it for my review of Far Beyond the Stars. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek materials. And if you would like to vote in these polls, it would be great to have more participation. Support me on Patreon. Even $1, anything will get you access to videos like this, which I release 2 months in advance for my Patreon supporters. And of course, they can determine which episode I'm going to review in these polls. And also other quirks, like other videos I release in advance. I have schedules in advance, and if you support more higher levels of Patreon support, where you can request your own video and I shall do them. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel for many other videos and other shows like The Expanse, Star Wars, Clone Wars, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.